Welcome to a very special edition of Ask the Expert on Contingent Workforce Strategies LinkedIn group. I am here with two of my favorite people in the industry, and they are always doing great things. And so, the topic of diversity within CW programs is a big one, and it had really caught a lot of momentum over the last couple of years, but I'm not sure that it's been done correctly by everyone. So I've enlisted two of my friends in the industry that I've known for a long, long time to come talk on the program and this topic. So Ashish Kaushal from Consciously Unbiased and Higher Talent, and Angela Westhead from Zendesk. Welcome to Ask the Expert, and thanks for taking time out of your busy days.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So tell me a little bit about your backgrounds, Ash, how you really started to focus on diversity, and Angela too. Like, you've got so many moving priorities, either as a vendor or as a client, right? And the focus on building incredible best practices within your programs and clients' programs has been a passion of both of yours.
So a little bit about my professional background. I've been in the contingent workforce space for almost 10 years. I know what you're thinking. How? You're so young. No. I started at Workforce Logic and just sort of kind of worked my way up through the ranks there, made the jump to the buyer side at Twitter, where I was the senior analyst for contingent workforce. And now I am a contingent workforce manager at Zendesk, and I lead all of our non-employee programs. So one thing that occurred to me as the last few years have gone on, I've had some kind of personal stuff that's happened that was very unexpected. I found myself a solo parent, and I found myself having to hold down a full-time job. All of this was happening while there was a lot of racial unrest and injustice. It really illuminated for me my privilege and the fact that even though I was dealt sort of a rough hand, it could have been a lot worse if I hadn't had a lot of the privilege and the luck that I was just given by virtue of being born a white cisgender woman in the United States. And I started to really think about, okay, how can I use that? How can I do better? And one of the ways I can do that in my professional life is by really investing in diverse suppliers and investing in inclusion for our contractors. So that's how I've chosen to use my power, whatever small amount of power it may be. And it's been very fulfilling and very rewarding. And I think it's made a good impact for folks. Ash?
Okay, great. And I personally worked with Angela, and I've seen the change she's made in the organization. Is really kind of amazing. So I think if you're a buyer, you should definitely reach out to her and talk to her about different strategies she does. I started, so in 2018, Higher Talent's been around for about 20 years, and we really focus on helping clients find diverse talent. And then in 2018, I was working on a Sunday. I was like, all these clients are asking us for diverse talent. They're putting pressure on HR, procurement, from a leadership level, and the staffing firms to find diverse talent. But then the ultimate decision maker, the hiring manager, wasn't really buying into the process. And so I took a step back and I said, why is this happening? And so I thought about society. We're so polarized today, where the left and the right speak past each other, and this is on a global scale. And everyone feels like they're a victim. And so I said, that's what we have in common, and we're all victims. And so commonality is the basis for understanding. And so then I started thinking about what's going on in corporate America. And we spend about $8 billion a year on training, and it's going to go up to $16 billion in the next 3 years in diversity training. And it's not really working. It's more of the check the box thing. And the reason it doesn't work is because, one, you're forced to go to it, like your manager makes you go, and you're forced to go. And so it's like your dad telling you to do something. You're not going to really, right? It's not going to resonate, right? Number two is, if you do go, and also if your friends tell you the same thing, that same story is going to resonate much better. And number two is, if you do go, a lot of it's stemmed on guilt, and guilt is one strategy, but it doesn't really help people make change on the mass scale. And then number three was, we're taught to feel like biases are bad, and they're not all bad. Some of them are based on life experiences, how we grew up, our family values, our community, and part of it's survival. So let's own it. Let's be proud about it. And now you're in control of how you apply them in the right situations. And that's where we go from passive to active. And that's where consciously unbiased is born. And so If you fast forward in that, the way we wanted to make change happen is we felt that if you could measure things at a micro level within organizations rather than macro level, then everyone has a space there, right? So the idea is if you don't, like if, for example, if you want to get 30% women in your company and they're all in the marketing group and all the engineers are Indian, then you're really just building different countries inside your company. There's no scale and ROI and diversity. And so if you start measuring at the micro level, everyone's included, and including the white male. And so I think it was important that we didn't ostracize any groups when we built this out. And that's been our approach.
Amazing. And this is a topic, once again, that's really gotten momentum over the last few years. And a lot of it maybe have been kind of that make yourself feel good and check the boxes, as you say, Ash. When looking at this, though, what are the true objectives that a company should put in their proposal to their executives to say, these are the objectives and the why that we're implementing? It's not just about checking the boxes. It's about these objectives we want to fulfill on. From a client perspective, Angela, what's some of the why that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, I would caution to say that my experience is very specific because I sort of live in tech world, and tech is just a little different in how we do things. So starting at Twitter, I know we were very much focused on domestic US hiring. And so that became a lot about gender and race. That is a very US specific metric we wanted to hit. We had a 25 by 25 goal that was company wide for hiring. So we wanted 25% of our US population to be from underrepresented groups by the year 2025. And it was my job and my team's job as the CW team to make sure we were mimicking that so that we were pipelining candidates in to help our TA team meet that goal. But it's really one of those things where I advise everyone who's coming up with this strategy to build themselves a council, an advisory council. Ask those pertinent partners in your organization, where are we going? Like literally where? If we're going to hire in Poland, for example, we're going to be hiring a different diversity slate than we are in India. So make sure that you know who to ask those questions of. And it'll vary industry by industry too. Tech is very male dominated. But if we're in, let's say, healthcare, and you've got like a travel nursing firm, you may want to hire more men. So it's about really knowing your industry and knowing your company and knowing who to ask within the walls of your company to find out where you need to start.
Ash, what are some of the whys you've seen with organizations you've worked with as well out there?
Some of the whys, I mean, honestly, at this point, I don't think there's a reason not to, because if you think about, I did a LinkedIn Live with Doug and Brian and Jennifer and all the sort of the veterans in the industry, and you look at the demographics, right? So right now, the Fed is increasing the interest rate to slow down the economy. At the same time, Congress is spending more money, which is at odds with what the Fed's trying to do, right? And so the unemployment rate's at 3.5%, even though we've laid off probably 1 million people since January, right? And then we've cut off immigration to a point of we have 2 million less people coming into the country since about the last 8 years. And our parents procreated much more than we are, and so they're retiring faster than we're bringing new candidates into the workforce, and that's an 18-year problem you can't fix overnight. So if you don't basically. And then the demographics are changing essentially. This is the first year that there is no majority in the US, right? So the white male is also a minority at this point. And so all the demographics are telling you that you have really no choice. And so I think that's the reason companies have to do it, is if they want to be competitive in the future, they're really going to have to create policies that are more than diversity, that they're actually inclusive policies, right? And so, for example, if you want to retain women in your organization, you need to create policies where they're still the primary caregiver. You need to create policies where they don't feel guilty about dropping their child off too early for a snow day and feel too guilty about coming in late for the same snow day, right? And so they're not winning on each side. And so that's not going to keep them in your organization. So I think it's important now that we create inclusive policies within organizations to be competitive in the future.
So you mentioned kind of some policy stuff. And so there's always a policy component to your diversity programs. What other components have you seen that companies kind of implement, be it thinking about increasing work with minority-owned and diverse companies, to thinking about spend, to thinking about different types of pools that they go and attract candidates from. What are some of the different components and things that you've seen companies, and Angela, in your travels, and things you've implemented? What are some of the components there of that a CW manager can say, okay, I want to look at this component, I want to look at this, and I want to look at this, and make these my priorities. And it's just, it's hard to boil the ocean, but it's also good to have focus on certain key components of a diversity program.
Yeah, I think it's really easy to attempt to boil the ocean here because we have sort of a wide breadth of things that are available right now. But I just kind of keep going back to number one, whatever the business objectives are. And then for me as the CW leader, I kind of like my program to mirror my ethics and my values, as sort of egotistical as that may sound. But I mean, it's one of those things where I'm leading it, I'm creating the strategy. It is going to kind of reflect me in some ways, right? So I got with business first. I know in tech, we're super big into neurodiversity. That's a great talent pool for us for a number of reasons. And so really diving in to see who's out there, what they're doing, and then seeing what we can do to implement is really important. I mean, I make no qualms that I feel very strongly about supporting women in tech as well, especially mothers. So that's a big part of my strategy as well. And it also feeds nicely into sort of addressing gender parity in tech as well. So I think for us, those are really the big ones, but I know there's so many great things out there, like Latinas in tech. The Mom Project does great work with their RISE scholarships for retraining and reskilling women, which I think is wonderful. And just, again, kind of goes back to mirroring what are your values as the leader, and then what are the values that you're trying to mimic for your company.
No, that's great advice. And really, when you combine kind of the conversation Ash had on why, although we have somewhat low unemployment, it's going to continue, right? Even if we see layoffs happening and these types, just because there aren't enough people in the workforce to fill the positions. And so you're going to have to look at alternative and non-traditional talent pools to get work done, right? And it's amazing. Ash, what are some of the different components that you've seen that become priorities within different programs when it comes to diversity, and some of the best practices you could recommend to someone starting out or inheriting the topic of diversity in their contingent program?
Sure. Angela named two of them. One was that she engaged the full-time and the HR group to say, what are our overall diverse policies? And let's also implement the same policies within contingent labor, right? Because if you want to get to a certain demographic footprint, or you want to get to a certain diversity or inclusion footprint, those have to be aligned, right? Because basically 40% of your workforce is temp labor at this point. And so that, number one. Number two is the person running your contingent labor has to have a passion for this, right? Because if it's not there, then it's not going to work. And they're the ones that are going to basically be the stewards of making sure this happens. And the contingent labor head has a chance to sort of change the culture and really make an impact in society. So I think that's really important. Number two is set goals. Number three is create inclusive policies. Number four is probably measuring, and make sure when you're measuring things, you have outcomes that you want to do with them. So if you just measure for the sake of measuring and you don't do anything with that, then it's going to create a lot of frustration with the organization. So only measure what you really want to change, and then have goals and outcomes based on what you measure. The ownership has to be owned by, like what I said in the beginning, ownership has to be owned by the managers and not something that's pushed down them. So when you're making these plans, make sure you get buy-in and that get their input from both the managers and the employees, so that it becomes contagious within the organization.
I think that the idea of the inauthenticity of people who are owning this can kind of set us up for that trap that we all know for the diverse vendor,
Yeah.
where we're not really we're not really reviewing what's past the surface, right? We've all kind of seen these vendors that are, nominally diverse owned, but aren't really stepping into their communities to invest or stepping into their communities at large with their contractor candidates. And if I'm going to be directing a lot of money towards people because they've gotten that certification, I want to know what they're actually doing. And if we're trying to go for impact, we need to understand where we're funneling our money. But I don't think that's a thought that someone who is leading from an inauthentic sort of I'm being told to do this kind of mindset is going to actually take that step.
Absolutely. And she brings up a
It's
good point.
actually interesting. Oh, sorry, Ash. Keep going.
She brings up a good point. So when looking at supplier diversity, look, everyone's pitching diversity right now because it's a buzzword, right? But reality is it true to their passion and are they able to bring diverse candidates? And I think that one of the ways you assess that is the agency have a diverse leadership, right? If I'm Indian and the rest of my board looks different than me or looks the same as me, then it's really not a diverse company, right? And they're not going to bring diverse talent to you. So you need to make sure that that's there. Number two is what are they doing within the communities to either curate that talent, outreach that talent, or build that talent. And so I think those are areas you want to look at to make sure that you're actually getting impact, not just the spend piece of it. And then on the spend side, I would say, look, the purpose of the spend came out in the 60s because if Angela was a business owner and Jeff, you were a large business owner, you wouldn't talk to Angela. And so the government had to create incentives for you to talk to Angela, right? And so they created this economic incentive. And so now you're talking to her and now she's grown her organization as a result because you're forced to partner on that piece. And that helps society in general, right? And I don't think that needs to go away just because that was phase one, and phase two is now, like I said, when I launched Consciously Unbiased, let's go beyond diversity spend and diversity hiring. That's phase two, but it doesn't mean that you get rid of phase one, which it still serves a purpose, right? Think of it as treasury services. It's a clearinghouse. It's the same thing that MasterCard and Visa do, and they're a valuable business. And so at this point, that still need to be done. But I think that where companies miss out on this is they want diversity spend because it's a tool to do marketing for their client to get the biggest customer in the world, which is the US government. So if they're getting some advantage out of that, why not? You shouldn't make your MSPs do a net neutral on this. You should actually put the extra cost of the diversity spend into a marketing budget and then pay that supplier, and then with that condition that supplier does something good in the community with that extra money. And so I think it could serve a purpose if it's handled properly. I think right now it's just not done in a way that's beneficial to the whole supply chain.
Yeah, and that's kind of the elephant in the room in our industry, right? Where one vendor that is certified minority owned gets the majority of the spend, and does it trickle down to the candidates and the workforce, and is it doing the good that it was meant to be, right? So I think the policy is great to begin with, to start the conversation like you said, but I think we're past that point now and saying, okay, is it really trickling down to the communities that it was intended to continue to trickle down, or is it just benefiting the owner of that company, right? So it's important to ensure that trickle down is happening and the spend that is going, the millions and millions of dollars of spend going through that process is getting to the candidates as well. And the candidates are getting opportunity to do well as well and move up in their careers, right? So you mentioned like a lot around the why in the beginning. And we're coming into an economic cycle that cost cutting is happening. And I worry that diversity may get put on the back burner, right? In a lot of people's mind. You also mentioned the workforce is diverse. And Angela, especially in technology, you've got all the engineers being a certain background, right? And marketing people being from a different background, and maybe they not talking because they're from different backgrounds. And the whole entire workforce is diverse, as opposed to, potentially separating people. The focus on inclusion is often overlooked, right? But probably potentially with the idea of bringing your workforce together and the productivity of helping people and from different cultures work together more productively, probably has a great ROI. Can you elaborate on some of that and some successes you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can use myself as a use case, I guess, for this, because I think when I was laid off, right, in the great culling of Twitter, and I was lucky enough to have several opportunities put to me, and I actively picked the one where the company demonstrated inclusion and diversity because I, as you guys know, am a single parent. And in order for me to do my job, I need flexibility. I need, like, today's a great example. Like, we had a hurricane day today. What am I supposed to do? And you guys know that I will outwork any other person in the room. I'm a great hire. And so I just need an employer that's going to say, hey, we know this one's going to outwork everybody in the room. She's going to build us a great program. But we understand that if there's a hurricane day, she needs to be able to pick up her daughter and make sure her daughter is taken care of. Almost everyone in the country has someone that they care for, that they look after. So why would we not want to become the employer of choice by saying, hey, we know that you're going to get your work done. So we're going to build policies where you can be a present parent and a present human being and be yourself at work and still get your work done. And even though I really speak to the subset of parents, because that's really true to my experience, we can see it across all different types of underrepresented groups. We can see it with inclusion for LGBTQ groups, for people of color. All of these inclusion programs where it becomes safe for you to be at work and be yourself and be a full human, the data shows that that is who attracts and retains talent. Those are the companies that put out the most creative and ship the most products because of the diversity of thought that happens. And when we're all speaking to each other internally and we're free to be our authentic selves, that's where the exchange of ideas becomes really hot. And when we start becoming the most innovative and the fastest moving, most agile companies that are out there.
Absolutely. Angela, you just reminded me. So we're one of the founding members supporting moms.us, which is an organization that's trying to change public policy in corporate America to help pay for childcare so mothers can actually work. And that's a deflationary policy, right? If you think about it, then if you open up the talent pool and allow basically 2 million women who aren't working right now to work, then you'd see gas prices and everything else drop at this point. I think so I'd love to have you guys involved in that if you're open to it.
Well, let's take a look. I'm very passionate, but clearly I'm very passionate about it.
But Jeff, going back to your question, so I think the reason DEI started getting canceled in the middle of recessions is because it wasn't set up in organizations as an economic initiative, right? An incentive. And so every time you do something in a business, you need to manage it like a business because they're in the business of making money at the end of the day. And so if you manage it like supply chain, for example, then I think that really works. So what's the benefit of helping diversity and inclusion? If you're a company like Delta, right, they hire a lot of people in lower income areas, your brand itself may be intimidating to somebody who didn't have whatever education they're assuming that you need to have, right? So there's assumptions that people make, especially I call it self-sabotage. I did it myself in college. And so now if you market to that group, then that community will now apply. So you've increased your talent pool, right? You take that talent pool and you've hired X amount of people in that community. You can go back to your city and say, hey, let's talk about our tax rate because we're doing all this employment. And so there's cost savings through the whole process, but there's also value that's been created in a new talent pool that you've created. And so I think when you look at diversity and inclusion, you have to make sure it has economic impact within an organization. You measure it like a business. And at the end of the day, if your goal was to get if you hired me to grow a division and I got 1% growth year over year, you'd fire me. Well, you need to manage that same thing with DI. If you have certain goals, set those expectations and manage like a business to make sure you're hitting those goals. And if you're not, then make them more aggressive. And so I think those are some of the things. And I think the other part of it is honestly what's happened with DEI. Diversity has become a bad word. And it's because, and when we first started Consciously Unbiased, we talked about focusing on our commonalities rather than our differences, right? Or if you don't feel comfortable doing that, focus on that you're different like me, because we're actually all different, right? And so if we focus on that, then I think that's where it highlights how we're similar to each other rather than different than each other.
Yeah, and that idea of inclusion actually brings people together, and bringing people together helps build trust and makes transactions easier. And so in that whole inclusion conversation, where have you seen some, tangible best practices to create conversations between different groups?
I think for me, the best I've seen was we allowed, specific to CW, but it's org wide. We allowed contractors into our ERGs and our BRGs, which created a safe space for people when they really needed it. For example, I know that we had a lot of folks join our parenting ERG. I was the marketing and communications chair for that at Twitter. And especially, during the height of COVID, when we're all struggling to get our work done and you've got children crawling on you and like all of these problems, it feels really good to know that you're not the only one. But it also gives you a voice within the organization too, because now you've got the collective voice of that group to go to leadership and say, we're all struggling with this internally. Here's what we can suggest as the experts in the area. Can you help us implement these policies? And I feel like if you've got enough people internally that are saying this is a blocker to productivity or this is a blocker to teamwork, and raise it to the appropriate people internally, you're going to get change in the organization.
Absolutely. That said perfectly. And I just add to that, just always remember this.
I like my spicy food. And on that note, I want to thank Angela and Ash for taking the time out of your day to have an unbelievably authentic conversation on the topic of bringing diversity into your CW programs, and some great ideas to start with, right? And everything always starts with the first step. So thanks again, guys, for being part of the discussion, and excited to see what's coming up this next year.
Thank you. It's an honor to do it with both of you guys.
Thank you.